I never should have taken the night shift at Potter's Field, but someone had to reset the stones, and I didn't know what walked that row after dark. My name is Marcus Ellis, and I have worked as a groundskeeper at Mercy Ridge Cemetery in Camden, New Jersey for 11 years. Potter's Field is what we call Section 9, the indigent burial area where the county sends John Does and Jane Does with no family, no money, no one to claim them. It's my job to keep it maintained, to make sure the markers stay straight and the grass stays trimmed. For a decade, it was just another part of the grounds. Then row 9C started turning. It began on a Tuesday morning in late September. I arrived at 6:30 like always, coffee in hand, ready to mow the southern quadrant before the heat set in. But when I reached section 9, I stopped. Every headstone in row 9C, all 14 of them, had been turned 180 degrees. They faced away from the path toward the woods at the back of the cemetery. I stood there for a long time, staring. Wind doesn't do that. Vandals would have knocked them over, spray painted them. These were simply rotated, perfectly aligned, like someone had taken their time. I spent the morning resetting them. Each stone weighed about 40 pounds. My back ached by lunch. I filed a report with the office, checked the security cameras. Nothing, just empty frames of the row at night, grainy and still. The next morning, they were turned again. I reset them, filed another report. This time, I asked to review the footage myself. I sat in the security office with Linda, our site manager, and watched the playback. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. The row was visible, lit by a single street lamp near the access road. For 16 minutes, nothing moved. Then the feed glitched. Just a flicker, maybe half a second, and when it resumed, the stones were turned. Equipment malfunction, Linda said. She didn't look at me. I reset them again that afternoon. This time, I stayed late, parked my truck near the equipment shed, and waited. The sun set behind the trees, and the cemetery grew quiet in that particular way it does at dusk. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of distant traffic. I sat there until midnight, watching the row through my windshield. Nothing happened. I went home. The stones were turned by morning. After the fourth time, I stopped filing reports. I just reset them. It became part of my routine. Mow, trim, reset row 9C. Some mornings I'd find them already turned. Some mornings they'd still be facing the right way, and I'd feel a strange relief that wouldn't last. By the second week, I started hearing things. It was always around 3 a.m., I know, because I started setting an alarm, waking myself up to listen. I'd lie in bed and think about those stones, about the woods behind them, and I wouldn't be able to sleep. So I'd drive back, park in the same spot, watch. The footsteps started on a Thursday. I heard them before I saw anything. A rhythmic crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. I got out of the truck, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the row. The stones were still facing forward. The footsteps continued. I followed the sound, my light sweeping left and right, but there was nothing. Just the crunch of footsteps on the path, moving up and down the row. Then they stopped. I stood in the middle of row 9C, breathing hard, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The air smelled like turned earth and cold metal. I counted the graves 1, 2, 3, all the way to 14. The last stone, the one at the far end near the woods, had something written on the back. I'd reset these markers a dozen times and never noticed it before. I crouched down, angling the light. It was a date, scratched into the granite, shallow and uneven, like someone had used a nail or a piece of metal. October 9th, 2011. That was next week. I went back to my truck and didn't return to Section 9 but for 3 days. When I finally did, the stones were facing the woods again. I reset them like always, working quickly, not looking at the last one, but when I reached it, I saw the date had changed. October 10th, 2011, tomorrow. I called in sick the next day, stayed home, doors locked, every light in the house on. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Linda. She'd attached an image from the security camera. The timestamp read 3:04 a.m. The photo showed row 9C, all 14 stones, turned toward the woods. And standing at the end of the row, just barely visible in the frame, was a figure. I didn't go back to Mercy Ridge for a week. When I did, the stones in row 9C were facing forward. They've stayed that way ever since. I still reset them when they turn, less often now, maybe once a month, but I don't stay late anymore. I don't listen for footsteps. And I never, ever check the back of that last stone. But sometimes, when I'm trimming the grass near Section 9, I hear it. That slow, deliberate crunch of gravel, always pacing, always stopping at the same grave. I just keep mowing. I thought I understood what silence meant until I heard something knocking from inside a body bag, 40 minutes into an empty highway drive. My name is Carmen Reyes, and I have worked as a mortuary transport driver for Riverside Funeral Services in Stockton, California for 7 years. My job is simple: pick up the deceased from hospitals, nursing homes, or the county morgue and bring them back to the funeral home for preparation. Most shifts are quiet. You learn not to think too much about what's in the back. You focus on the road, the paperwork, the next pickup. That's how you get through it. That's how I got through it, until the night I transported John Doe, number 83. The call came in at 11:45 p.m., county morgue, unclaimed body, male, approximate age 60, found unresponsive in a downtown motel. No identification, no next of kin, no personal effects except a wallet with $3 and a library card that led nowhere. The county would bury him in Potter's Field within the week. I'd done this run 100 times. I arrived at the morgue just after midnight. The attendant, a tired-looking woman named Denise, helped me load the body into the van. He was already in the black vinyl bag, zipped and tagged. We lifted him onto the gurney together, secured the straps, and I signed the transfer paperwork. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. Denise locked the loading dock behind me, and I started the drive back. The route from the county morgue to Riverside takes about 40 minutes on a good night, most of it along Highway 99. It's a straight shot, minimal traffic after midnight, just long enough to listen to a podcast or run through the next day's schedule in your head. I'd made the drive so many times I could do it on autopilot. That's what I was doing when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was something loose in the back, maybe the gurney strap or a piece of equipment shifting around. I turned down the radio and listened. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The back of the van was dark except for the faint glow of my phone charging on the dashboard. I couldn't see the body bag, but I knew exactly where it was. The tapping stopped. I exhaled, turned the radio back up, and kept driving, probably just the road, expansion joints in the asphalt, my imagination working overtime after a long shift. I was tired. That's all it was. Then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, clearer, not tapping, knocking, 3 deliberate knocks, like knuckles on wood. I pulled onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and sat there with my hands gripping the wheel. The knocking continued. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It was coming from the back of the van. I got out, walked to the rear doors, and stood there for a long time before I opened them. The interior light flickered on. The body bag lay on the gurney exactly as I'd loaded it. Straps secured, tag visible. Everything looked normal. I reached out and touched the vinyl. It was cold and smooth under my fingers. I waited, silence. I closed the doors, got back in the driver's seat, and continued toward Riverside. The knocking didn't start again until I was 10 minutes from the funeral home. This time, I didn't stop. I turned the radio up as loud as it would go and focused on the white lines of the highway. My hands were shaking. The knocking grew faster, more insistent, and then it stopped completely, just as I pulled into the funeral home's back lot. I sat in the van for a full 5 minutes before I opened the doors. When I finally did, I unzipped the body bag just enough to check the identification tag and make sure nothing had shifted during transport. That's when I saw his hand. It was positioned differently than when Denise and I had loaded him. I was sure of it. When we'd transferred him from the morgue gurney to mine, his arms had been straight at his sides, palms down, the way they always are. Now his right hand was raised slightly, fingers curled. Not clenched, not relaxed, curled, like he'd been knocking on something. I zipped the bag back up, logged the transfer, and wheeled him into cold storage. I didn't mention the hand position in my report. I didn't mention the knocking. I finished my shift, went home, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. At 3:17 a.m., I called Denise. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. I asked her if she remembered how the body's hands were positioned when we loaded him. There was a long pause. Straight down, she said finally, palms flat. Why? I told her they were curled when I unloaded him. Another pause. Carmen, she said quietly, that's not possible. I know. Did you check the footage? I had. The funeral home's loading dock has a security camera aimed at the back entrance. I'd pulled up the recording before I called her. It showed me opening the van doors, unzipping the bag, staring at something for a long time, then zipping it back up and wheeling the gurney inside. The angle didn't show the body itself, just my face. And my expression, wide eyed, frozen, told me everything I needed to know. I still do transport runs. I still pick up unclaimed boys from the county morgue. But now, when I drive that 40-minute stretch of Highway 99, I keep the radio off. I listen, and if I hear knocking, I don't stop. I don't open the doors until I'm back at Riverside, under the floodlights, with someone else nearby. Because I know now that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the moment just before something starts knocking back. Every cemetery keeps secrets beneath the soil, but I didn't expect to dig one up that had no name, no record, and no right to exist. My name is Harold Vance, and I have worked as a groundskeeper at Greenwood Memorial Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois for 19 years. My responsibilities include grave preparation, which means I dig. I've opened hundreds of plots in my time here, measuring, excavating, making sure the dimensions are correct before a burial service. It's methodical work, honest work. You follow the plot map, you dig where you're told, and you don't ask questions. That's how it's always been, until I was assigned to prepare an indigent burial in Section 7 and found something that wasn't supposed to be there. The work order came through on a Wednesday morning in mid-October. Plot 712C, County Burial. John Doe, no service, no family, just a simple interment scheduled for Friday. I loaded the backhoe, gathered my tools, and drove out to Section 7 just after sunrise. The section is older, mostly filled, with rows of weathered markers and overgrown grass we only trim twice a month. Budget cuts. The county plots are in the back corner, near the property line where the fence meets the woods. I parked the backhoe, checked the plot map, and started measuring. 712C should have been in the third row, 12 plots in, right between 712B and 712D. But when I measured it out, the spacing was wrong. There wasn't enough room. I rechecked the map, recounted the markers. Something was off. That's when I noticed the sunken patch of ground. It was subtle, just a slight depression in the earth, maybe 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. The grass had grown over it, but you could see the outline if you looked carefully. I knelt down and brushed away some of the overgrowth. Beneath it, partially buried in the soil, was the edge of something wooden. I cleared more dirt away with my hands and found a casket lid. It was old. The wood was dark and waterlogged, soft in places where rot had set in. There was no headstone, no marker, nothing to indicate who was buried there or when. But scratched into the wood, shallow and crooked, was a number, 447. I radioed the office, told them I'd found an unmarked grave in Section 7 and needed someone to check the records before I proceeded. Emma, our records clerk, said she'd look into it. I waited by the backhoe, staring at that sunken patch of ground, and tried not to think about what was inside. Emma called back 20 minutes later. There was no plot 447 in our system, no record of any burial at those coordinates. Section 7 only went up to plot 380, and all of those were accounted for. She suggested it might be an old family plot from before the cemetery was incorporated, something that predated our digital records. She'd check the archives, but it would take time. I covered the sunken area with a tarp, marked it with flagging tape, and dug the county plot 3 feet to the left. The burial happened on Friday as scheduled. No one mentioned the unmarked grave. I assumed it would get sorted out eventually. That night, I stayed late to finish some maintenance work near the equipment shed. Around 9 p.m., I drove past Section 7 on my way out and saw something that made me stop the truck. The tarp I'd placed over the sunken grave was pulled aside, and there was fresh dirt piled on top of the depression, dark, wet soil that hadn't been there that afternoon. I got out and walked over. The dirt was loose, like someone had been digging. I pulled the tarp back completely and saw that the wooden casket lid was now partially exposed, more visible than it had been that morning, and the number scratched into the wood, 447, looked deeper somehow, more pronounced. I covered it again, weighted the tarp down with rocks, and left. The next morning, the dirt was back. I checked with the other groundskeepers. No one had been in Section 7 overnight. I checked the security logs. No vehicles had entered the cemetery after closing. I asked Emma if she'd found anything in the archives. She said there was no mention of a Plot 447 anywhere in the records, not in the old ledgers, not in the incorporation documents, nothing. I started finding the fresh dirt every morning after that. Always the same amount, always piled on the same spot. I'd clear it away, recover the grave, and by the next day it would be back. After a week, I stopped clearing it. I just left it alone and worked around it. Then, 2 weeks after I first found the grave, I was trimming the grass in Section 7 and heard something. A low, rhythmic sound, like breathing. I turned off the mower and listened. It was coming from the ground near Plot 447. Slow, deliberate breaths, muffled by soil and wood and time. I left the mower running and walked to the equipment shed. I didn't go back to Section 7 that day. Emma finally found something in the archives last month, a handwritten note in a ledger from 1987. It mentioned a Plot 447 in Section 7 marked as closed with no other details. No name, no date of death, no burial record, just the word closed and a line drawn through the entry. I asked her what that meant. She said she didn't know. I still maintain Section 7. I mow the grass, trim the hedges, reset the markers when they shift. But I don't go near the sunken patch of ground anymore. I don't clear the dirt. I don't look at the number scratched into the wood. And when I'm working that section, I keep the mower running loud enough that I can't hear anything beneath the soil, because some mornings, when the wind is still and the section is quiet, I can hear it. That slow, rhythmic breathing, and it sounds like it's getting closer to the surface. The dirt keeps piling up every night, like something underneath is trying to dig its way out. I've worked with the dead long enough to know they don't move, but that certainty shattered the moment I turned my back on John Doe number 17 and returned to find him watching the door. My name is David Chen, and I have worked as a licensed embalmer at Hartfield Funeral Home in Portland, Oregon for 12 years. The night shift is mine by choice. Fewer distractions, no family members asking questions, just the quiet work of preparation. I prefer it that way. There's a rhythm to embalming, a careful sequence of steps that requires focus and respect. You drain, you preserve, you restore. You give dignity to the deceased. In all my years doing this work, I'd never had a problem. The dead don't complain. They don't move. They stay exactly where you place them until they don't. The call came in just before midnight on a Thursday in late November. County transfer, John Doe, male, mid-50s, found deceased in a downtown shelter. No identification, no family, no one to claim him. The county would cover a basic preparation and burial in Potter's Field. I'd handled dozens of cases like this. I accepted the transfer, logged the paperwork, and prepared the embalming room. He arrived at 1:15 a.m. The transport driver helped me move him from the gurney to the table, and I signed the receipt. The driver left, and I was alone with John Doe number 17. I began the standard procedures: external examination, identification verification, positioning. He was thin, with gray hair and weathered hands. His face was gaunt, but peaceful. I positioned his arms at his sides, tilted his head slightly to ensure proper drainage, and began setting up the equipment. Arterial tube, drainage tube, embalming fluid, mixed to the appropriate concentration. Everything routine, everything normal. I stepped away to retrieve additional supplies from the storage cabinet across the room. I was gone maybe 30 seconds. When I turned back toward the table, his head had moved. I stopped, stared. His head was no longer tilted slightly to the left as I'd positioned it. It was facing straight ahead toward the door. I walked closer. The angle was wrong, definitely wrong. I'd been doing this work for over a decade. I knew how I'd positioned him. This wasn't settling. This wasn't gravity. This was different. I adjusted his head back to the correct position, checked the neck for rigor mortis, and continued my work. Probably just residual muscle tension, I told myself. Air escaping from the lungs. There were explanations for these things. I made my arterial injection, started the pump, and monitored the flow. Everything proceeded normally for about 10 minutes. Then the pump stuttered. I checked the lines, no blockage, no air bubbles. I adjusted the pressure and it smoothed out. I turned to make a note in the case log, and when I looked back at the table, his head had moved again. This time, it was turned all the way to the right, facing the door, not tilted, not slumped, turned, like he was looking at something. I felt my pulse quicken. I walked around the table, examined the body from every angle. There was no logical reason for the head to move that way. I repositioned it again, this time placing a small support beneath the neck to stabilize it. I stepped back and watched. Nothing moved. I waited 5 minutes. 10. 15. The body remained still. I returned to my work, draining the blood, continuing the arterial injection, monitoring the pressure. I was focused on the tubes, on the flow rate, on maintaining the correct mixture. I didn't look at his face. I didn't want to, but I could feel it, that sensation you get when someone is watching you. I tried to ignore it, tried to concentrate on the procedure, but the feeling intensified. Finally, I looked up. His eyes were open. I stopped, stepped back. His eyes had been closed when I started. I was certain of that. I always check. But now they were open, not wide, not staring, just slightly parted, the lids pulled back just enough to show the whites. I grabbed a pair of eye caps from the supply tray, approached the table, and leaned over to set them in place. That's when I noticed his expression had changed. When I'd first positioned him, his face had been slack, neutral. Now there was tension in the jaw. The corners of his mouth were pulled down slightly, like he was concentrating, like he was listening to something. I placed the eye caps, worked quickly, and stepped back. My hands were shaking. I'd been doing this work for 12 years, and I'd never had a reaction like this. Bodies don't move. They don't open their eyes. They don't change expressions. There were explanations for all of it: muscle relaxation, gas buildup, tissue settling, but none of them felt adequate standing there in the fluorescent light of the embalming room at 2:30 in the morning. I checked the security camera footage later, after I'd finished the preparation and moved John Doe number 17 to cold storage. Hartfield has cameras in all the prep rooms. Insurance requirement. I pulled up the recording and watched myself work. Everything looked normal. I positioned the head, walked to the storage cabinet, returned. The head was in a different position. I adjusted it, turned away, turned back. The head had moved again, but here's what made me stop the playback and sit there for a long time, staring at the screen. In the video, just before I turned around each time, there's a fraction of a second where the body's head is already moving, turning, deliberately, slowly, like he was tracking my movement across the room. I logged the case, completed the paperwork, and locked the embalming room. I didn't tell anyone about the footage. I didn't file an incident report. I just marked the case as complete and moved on to the next one. John Doe, number 17, was buried 3 days later in Section 9 of Riverside Cemetery. County burial, no service, no mourners. I didn't attend. I never attend indigent burials. But I think about him sometimes, late at night, when I'm working alone. I think about the way his head turned toward the door, like he was watching for something, or someone. I still work the night shift. I still prepare the unclaimed, the forgotten, the lost. But now, when I step away from the table to retrieve supplies, I don't turn my back completely. I keep the body in my peripheral vision. I watch for movement, because I learned that night that the dead might not speak, but that doesn't mean they're not paying attention. And sometimes, when the room is very quiet, I wonder if John Doe number 17 is still watching, still waiting, still turned toward the door. I buried him under the name the county gave him, but the woman in black knew different, and 3 days later, so did his headstone. My name is Elena Ortiz, and I have worked as a funeral director at Sacred Heart Memorial in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 16 years. My job includes coordinating indigent burials, county-funded services for unclaimed bodies with no family or resources. These are quiet ceremonies. Most of the time, no one attends. We say a prayer, lower the casket, and fill the grave. It's dignified work, necessary work, but it's lonely. You get used to the empty folding chairs, the single bouquet provided by the funeral home, the silence. What you don't get used to is someone appearing who shouldn't exist. The burial was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early March. The deceased was listed as Michael Bradford, a name assigned by the county when they couldn't verify his identity. He'd been found in a vacant apartment downtown, dead for several days before anyone noticed. No wallet, no phone, no emergency contacts. The county ran his fingerprints through the system and came up empty. So they gave him a name, issued a death certificate, and arranged for burial. Michael Bradford, Plot 38 in Section 4. A white cross with his name and dates. That's all anyone would ever know about him. The service was scheduled for 10 a.m. I arrived at the gravesite at 9:30 to make sure everything was in order. The casket had been placed beside the open grave. The lowering device was in position, and Father Sandoval was reviewing his notes. I set up 6 folding chairs out of habit, even though I knew no one would come. No one ever did for county burials. But at 9:55, a woman appeared. She came from the parking lot, walking slowly between the headstones, dressed entirely in black. Long coat, dark scarf, sunglasses despite the overcast sky. I watched her approach, assuming she was visiting another grave and had simply taken a wrong turn. But she walked directly to our site and sat in the front row of chairs, hands folded in her lap. I approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you here for the Bradford service?" She nodded but didn't speak. "Did you know the deceased?" She turned to look at me. I couldn't see her eyes behind the sunglasses, but I felt the weight of her gaze. "His name," she said quietly, "was not Bradford." I paused. "I'm sorry?" "His name was Daniel Carver, not Michael Bradford. Daniel Carver." I didn't know what to say. The county had issued the name. They'd tried to identify him. If she knew him, if she had information, she should have come forward weeks ago. "Ma'am, if you have information about the deceased's identity, you'll need to contact the county clerk's office. They handle—" "I'm here to bury Daniel," she interrupted. "Not Michael, not Bradford, Daniel Carver." Father Sandoval had started the service. I excused myself and returned to my position beside the grave, but I kept watching the woman. She sat perfectly still throughout the brief ceremony, her hands never moving, her head never bowing. When Father Sandoval finished the final prayer, she stood, walked to the casket, and placed her palm flat against the wood. She whispered something I couldn't hear, then she left. Walked back through the cemetery the same way she'd come, disappeared into the parking lot. I wanted to follow her, to ask questions, but the groundskeepers were waiting to fill the grave, and I had another service at noon. I made a note to check with the county later to see if anyone had filed a missing person report for a Daniel Carver. Then I returned to the funeral home and moved on with my day. 3 days later, I received a call from the cemetery maintenance supervisor. There was a problem with Plot 38 in Section 4. Could I come out and take a look? I drove over that afternoon. The supervisor, a man named Miguel, met me at the grave. I don't know how this happened, he said, gesturing to the temporary marker, but someone altered it. I looked down at the white cross. The name had been changed. Where it had read Michael Bradford, it now read Daniel Carver. The letters were carved into the wood, deep and precise, in a style that matched the original engraving, not spray painted, not scratched, carved, as if it had always said Daniel Carver. Vandalism? I asked, though I already knew that wasn't right. Miguel shook his head. I checked the cameras. No one's been near this plot since the burial. And look at this. He knelt beside the marker. The wood grain matches. This isn't a replacement. Someone carved over the original name, but the depth and style are identical to the first engraving. I've never seen anything like it. I took photos, filed a report with the cemetery, and contacted the county clerk's office. They had no record of a Daniel Carver, no missing person report, no death certificate, no match in their system. I described the woman in black, asked if anyone matching her description had come forward with information. Nothing. I returned to Plot 38 the following week. The marker still read Daniel Carver. I stood there for a long time, staring at the name, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. There was a second set of dates beneath the name. Faint, almost invisible unless you looked closely, carved in the same style as the rest of the text. The death date matched Michael Bradford's, but the birth date was different, 30 years earlier, too early to belong to the man we'd buried. I pulled the intake paperwork when I got back to the office, checked the county records. The deceased had been estimated at mid-40s. The birth date on the marker would have made him 76. It didn't match. I called the county medical examiner, asked if there was any possibility of an age discrepancy. She said the autopsy had been thorough. The deceased was definitely in his 40s. Dental records, bone density, tissue analysis all confirmed it. There was no mistake. I went back to Plot 38 one more time, late on a Friday afternoon when the cemetery was nearly empty. I brought a rubbing kit and traced the engraved letters. When I compared the rubbing to the original order form for the marker, the handwriting was identical. Not similar, identical. The letters spelling Daniel Carver matched exactly the style, depth, and spacing of the letters that had originally spelled Michael Bradford, like they'd been carved by the same hand at the same time. I checked the cemetery cameras myself, reviewed every frame from the burial to the day the name was discovered, changed. Nothing. The grave was never approached. The marker was never touched. But somehow, between Tuesday morning and Friday afternoon, the name transformed. I never saw the woman in black again. I checked attendance logs for every service over the next 6 months. No one matching her description appeared. I drove to the vacant apartment where the deceased had been found, asked neighbors if they remembered anyone named Daniel Carver. No one did. Plot 38 still bears the name Daniel Carver. The county never corrected it. After a while, they stopped trying to explain it. The man is buried under a name no one can verify, with dates that don't match his age, in a grave attended by a woman who doesn't exist. I still conduct indigent burials. I still set up folding chairs for mourners who never come. But now, when I stand at the graveside and read the county assigned name, I wonder if it's the right one. I wonder if somewhere, someone knows the truth. Someone dressed in black, whispering to the dead, telling them their real name, making sure they're remembered, even if no one else knows they exist. I locked the doors after an indigent viewing where no one came, but the security footage showed I wasn't alone for 2 hours afterward. My name is Ashley Morgan, and I have worked as a funeral attendant at Hillside Memorial Chapel in Richmond, Virginia for 8 years. My responsibilities include setting up viewings, maintaining the parlor rooms, and closing the facility at night. Most viewings are attended, families gather, people pay respects, someone always shows up. But indigent viewings are different. The county schedules them as a formality, a final opportunity for anyone who might have known the deceased to say goodbye. Usually, no one does. The viewing for Margaret Hawthorne was scheduled for Thursday evening, 6 to 8 p.m. She was 74 years old, found deceased in a boarding house on the east side. No family listed, no emergency contacts, no one to claim her body. The county provided basic services: embalming, a simple casket, a 2-hour viewing window. I prepared Parlor B the same way I always did. Folding chairs arranged in rows, a guest book on a podium by the entrance, soft lighting, a single arrangement of white carnations beside the open casket. Margaret looked peaceful. Our embalmer, Thomas, had done good work. Her hair was styled neatly, her hands folded across her chest. She wore a donated dress, pale blue, clean and pressed. I stood beside the casket for a moment before opening the doors, studying her face. She looked like someone's grandmother, someone's neighbor, someone who'd lived a whole life that no one had shown up to witness the end of. I opened the parlor doors at exactly 6 p.m. and returned to my desk in the lobby. I had paperwork to process, phone calls to return. I checked the parlor every 20 minutes. No one came. By 7:30, I'd accepted that Margaret Hawthorne would have her viewing alone. It happened more often than people realized. At 8 p.m., I closed the guest book, still blank, and entered the parlor to prepare the casket for closure. That's when I noticed the chair. One of the folding chairs in the front row was positioned differently than I'd set it. Not knocked over, not displaced, just angled, as if someone had been sitting in it and had turned slightly to face the casket more directly. I stood there, staring at it. I'd checked the parlor 3 times during the viewing. The chairs had been empty, all of them. I straightened the chair, closed the casket, and locked the parlor. Then I armed the security system, locked the front doors, and went home. The call came at 11:45 p.m. It was Jerry, our security monitoring service. The motion sensors in Parlor B had triggered. Could I check the remote camera feed? I pulled up the app on my phone and accessed the live stream. The parlor was empty. The casket was closed. Nothing moved. Probably just the heating system, Jerry said, but protocol says I have to notify you. I thanked him and went back to sleep. The next morning, I arrived at Hillside. At 7:30 a.m., Thomas was already there, preparing another case. I told him about the motion sensor. He shrugged and said old buildings settle, especially overnight when the temperature drops. I agreed and went to unlock Parlor B. The casket was still closed. The chairs were still in place. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, but the guest book, which I'd closed and left on the podium, was open, and someone had signed it. The signature was in careful cursive, written in blue ink. Dorothy Hawthorne. The timestamp beside it read 7:45 p.m., 45 minutes before I'd closed the parlor. I checked my memory. I'd looked at that guest book at 7:30. It had been blank. I was certain. I flipped through my phone and found the photo I'd taken for the file records. Standard documentation we kept for all county cases. The photo showed the open guest book at 7:55 p.m., 5 minutes before I closed the parlor. Blank pages, no signature. I took the guest book to Thomas. He examined it, compared it to the photo. Could have been there and you just missed it, he offered. I photographed it blank at 7:55. The timestamp says she signed at 7:45. He didn't have an explanation. I pulled the security footage that afternoon. We kept cameras in the lobby and the hallways, but not inside the parlor rooms, privacy concerns. But the hallway camera had a partial view of Parlor B's entrance. I watched the recording from 6 p.m. onward. At 6:17 p.m., I walked past the camera toward the parlor, checked inside, and returned to my desk. At 6:43 p.m., I did it again. At 7:11 p.m. and 7:32 p.m., the same routine. The parlor entrance remained empty between my checks. No one entered. No one left. Then, at 7:46 p.m., something moved in the frame. The angle didn't show the interior of the parlor clearly, just the doorway and a sliver of the front row of chairs. But at 7:46 p.m., a shadow crossed that sliver, a figure, barely visible, moving slowly past the entrance. It paused, then it moved back, like someone walking to the guest book podium, signing and returning to their seat. I rewound the footage and watched it again. The figure was there, definitely there. I could see the edge of a dark coat, the suggestion of gray hair, a slow, careful walk. The timestamp read 7:46 p.m. I called Jerry at the security company, asked him to review the motion sensor logs from the previous night. He pulled them up and read them back to me. The sensors in Parlor B had triggered multiple times during the viewing hours. The first activation was at 7:47 p.m. The last was at 9:53 p.m., nearly 2 hours after I'd locked the doors and left. You said the room was empty when you closed it? Jerry asked. Yes. Then I don't know what to tell you. These sensors are commercial grade. They don't false trigger. I went back to Parlor B, stood in the doorway, and tried to reconstruct what had happened. Someone had been in the room. Someone had signed the guest book. Someone had sat in that chair, watching Margaret Hawthorne's casket, for at least 2 hours after I'd locked the building. I looked up Dorothy Hawthorne in our records system. No matches. I called the county clerk's office, asked if they had any information about relatives of Margaret Hawthorne. They checked the intake file. Margaret had listed one emergency contact years ago when she'd first moved to Richmond, a sister named Dorothy. But Dorothy Hawthorne had died in 2003, 22 years ago. The burial was the next day. I didn't attend. I helped load the casket into the transport van and watched it leave. I cleaned Parlor B, reset the chairs, closed the guest book, and moved on to the next service. But sometimes, late in the evening when I'm closing the facility, I check the security footage before I leave. I watch the hallway cameras, scan the parlor entrances, make sure I'm alone, because I know now that the guest book can be signed by hands I'll never see, that chairs can be moved by people who aren't there, that viewings aren't always as empty as they appear. And when I pass Parlor B and see a chair angled toward where the casket would be, I don't straighten it. I just close the door and let whoever's sitting there finish their goodbye. I've filled hundreds of graves in my career, but I only heard a voice from 6 feet down once, and it said two words that still wake me at night. My name is Luis Cordero, and I have worked as a gravedigger at Evergreen Cemetery in Fresno, California for 23 years. People don't use the term gravedigger much anymore. They call us groundskeepers or cemetery maintenance specialists, but that's what I do. I dig graves. I fill them. I maintain the earth that holds the dead. It's physical work, honest work, and in all my years doing it, I've never had a problem. The dead stay buried. They don't move. They don't speak. That's the fundamental rule of my profession, the one certainty I've built my career on. Until I buried John Doe, number 41, in Potter's Field. The burial was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in late August. County case, indigent plot, no service. Just me, the casket, and the open grave. Potter's Field is in the oldest section of Evergreen, back near the maintenance shed where we store equipment. The plots are small, marked with temporary crosses, and they're filled in chronological order. When one row is complete, we start another. Simple, efficient, anonymous. I'd prepared the grave that morning, using the backhoe, 6 feet deep, clean walls, proper dimensions. Standard procedure. The casket arrived just after noon, delivered by the county transport service. The driver helped me position it on the lowering device, signed the paperwork, and left. I was alone. I activated the lowering device and watched the casket descend into the grave. The straps released at the bottom, and I removed the device. Then I started filling, shovel first, to settle the soil around the casket and prevent shifting. I worked methodically, tossing dirt from the pile beside the grave, watching it cascade down onto the casket lid. The sound was rhythmic, almost meditative. Shovel, toss, fall, shovel, toss, fall. I'd been working for maybe 10 minutes when I heard it. A voice from inside the grave. I stopped, stood completely still, shovel in hand. The cemetery was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic on Highway 41. No wind, no birds, just that heavy August heat and the smell of turned earth. Then I heard it again. Not yet. 2 words. Quiet but distinct. Eld voice, hoarse, strained, coming from 6 feet down. I dropped the shovel and stepped to the edge of the grave. Looked down. The casket was partially covered with dirt, maybe a foot of soil piled on the lid. I could see the brass handles, the smooth wood grain. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. "Hello?" I called down. Silence. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. I told myself it was wind through the trees, or a sound carrying from the highway, or my imagination playing Oryx in the heat. But I'd heard it. I knew I'd heard it. I picked up the shovel and started to fill again, slower this time, listening. 3 shovelfuls later, the voice came again. Not yet. Same tone, same words, clearer now, more urgent. I threw the shovel down and ran to my truck, grabbed my radio and called the office. Told them I needed backup at Potter's Field, that I'd heard something from inside the grave. Linda, the site manager, asked me to repeat that. I did. She said she'd send someone right away. 20 minutes later, Linda arrived with Marcus, another groundskeeper, and Thomas, our funeral director. I explained what I'd heard. Thomas looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but Linda had worked at Evergreen for 30 years, and she'd heard stories. She authorized an exhumation. We rigged the straps back onto the casket and used the lowering device in reverse, pulling it up from the grave. It took 40 minutes to secure the lines and extract it safely. When the casket finally emerged and we set it on the grass beside the grave, we all stood there, staring at it. "You want to open it?" Marcus asked. I did, and I didn't. Thomas checked the seal. It was intact. No tampering, no damage. He looked at Linda. She nodded. He opened the casket. John Doe, number 41, lay inside exactly as he'd been positioned at the funeral home, arms crossed, eyes closed, dressed in donated clothes. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. Thomas checked for vital signs anyway, pressing his fingers to the neck, checking for breath, for a pulse, for any indication of life. Nothing. We closed the casket, sealed it again, lowered it back into the grave. "Heat exhaustion," Thomas said, as we walked back to the vehicles. "You've been working in 90-degree weather for 6 hours. Drink some water, take the rest of the day off." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't explain what I'd heard. We all heard things sometimes. Sounds carry strangely in cemeteries, echo off headstones, filter through trees. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was heat, exhaustion, stress. But when I returned to finish filling the grave the next morning, I saw something that made me stop the truck 50 feet away. The dirt I'd shoveled into the grave the previous day, maybe a foot of loose soil, had been pushed aside. Not scattered, not wind-blown, pushed in neat piles on either side of the grave, like someone had been digging from below. I got out and approached the edge, looked down. The casket was visible again, the lid clear of dirt, and on the lid, pressed into a thin layer of dust, was a handprint. I radioed Linda. She came out, examined the grave, and called the county medical examiner. They sent an investigator who documented everything, took photos, collected samples. 2 days later, they exhumed the casket again and transported it to the morgue for examination. The autopsy confirmed what we already knew. John Doe number 41 had been dead for 9 days at the time of burial. No signs of trauma, no indication he'd been buried alive. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. The medical examiner couldn't explain the handprint. Neither could the investigator. The casket was returned to Evergreen a week later. Linda assigned Marcus to handle the burial. I didn't object. Marcus filled the grave in one afternoon, used the backhoe to cover it completely, and tamped it down with the compactor. No one heard voices. No one found handprints. The grave stayed filled, but I started having dreams about a month later. The same dream every night. I'm standing at the edge of a grave, looking down at a casket, and I hear that voice. Not yet. And in the dream, I don't run. I don't radio for help. I just keep shoveling, burying the voice deeper and deeper until I can't hear it anymore. I still work at Evergreen. I still dig graves and fill them, but I don't work Potter's Field anymore. I requested a transfer to the newer sections, the ones with families and flowers and headstones with names. Linda approved it without asking questions. She understood, because once you hear a voice from 6 feet down, once you see that handprint on the lid, once you understand that some people aren't ready to be buried, even when they're already dead, you can't go back to that section of the cemetery. You can't stand at the edge of an unmarked grave and shovel dirt onto a nameless casket without wondering if they're listening, without wondering if they're trying to tell you something, without wondering if not yet was a warning or a request or a promise. I pass Potter's Field sometimes when I'm driving the maintenance routes. I see the rows of white crosses, the temporary markers, the anonymous dead, and I think about John Doe, number 41. I think about that handprint. I think about those 2 words, and I wonder how many others down there are waiting, listening, saying the same thing over and over to the empty earth above them. Not yet, not yet, not yet. Every night at exactly 2:47 a.m., the infrared camera captures a figure standing over a fresh indigent grave. But when I drive to the location, there's never anyone there. My name is Amir Patel, and I have worked as a security guard at Oakwood Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio for 14 years. The night shift is mine, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. My job is simple: monitor the cameras, patrol the grounds, make sure no one vandalizes the headstones or dumps trash in the cemetery. In 14 years, I've dealt with teenagers drinking by the mausoleums, copper thieves trying to steal plaques, and the occasional homeless person looking for a quiet place to sleep. What I haven't dealt with until 3 weeks ago is something that appears on camera but doesn't exist when I go to investigate. The cemetery has 12 infrared cameras positioned throughout the grounds, covering the main gates, the chapel, the older sections, and the indigent burial area near the back fence. The cameras switch to night vision mode automatically after sunset, and they're motion activated. If something moves within range, the system logs it and sends an alert to my phone. Most nights, I get alerts for deer, raccoons, or feral cats. Sometimes tree branches swaying in the wind. Nothing unusual. The first alert came on a Thursday night at 2:47 a.m., camera 9, which covers the indigent section. I pulled up the feed on my monitor. The image was grainy, rendered in shades of green and black, but I could see the figure clearly. Someone was standing beside a fresh grave. I recognized it as Plot 87, filled just that afternoon. The figure was motionless, arms at their sides, facing the grave. I radioed my location and drove the security cart to the indigent section. It took maybe 3 minutes to get there. When I arrived, the area was empty. I walked through the rows, checking behind headstones, scanning the tree line. No one. I returned to the office and reviewed the camera footage. The figure had disappeared at 2:51 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after first appearing. I logged it as a possible trespasser and continued my rounds. The second alert came the next night, same time, 2:47 a.m., same camera, same location. I watched the figure appear on my monitor, standing in the exact same position beside Plot 87. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and drove to the location immediately, pushing the cart as fast as it would go. I arrived in under 2 minutes. Empty. Again. I stood beside the grave, exactly where the figure had been standing moments before, and scanned the area with my flashlight. The ground was soft from recent rain. If someone had been standing here, there should have been footprints. There weren't any. Just the disturbed earth of the grave and the tire tracks from my own cart. I returned to the office and watched the footage. The figure had vanished at 2:49 a.m., 30 seconds before I'd arrived. The third night, I stayed at the office and watched the monitor in real time. At 2:46 a.m., I positioned myself in front of camera 9's feed, ready to see the figure appear. At exactly 2:47 a.m., it did. The image quality was poor, but I could make out certain details. The figure was wearing dark clothing, a coat or jacket, possibly a hat. They stood completely still, not swaying, not shifting weight, just standing, watching the grave. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the security cart. This time, I didn't radio my location. I didn't log the alert. I just drove, keeping my eyes on the path, moving as fast as the cart would allow. I reached the indigent section in 90 seconds. Empty. I checked my watch. 2:49 a.m. I'd arrived within 2 minutes of the figure's appearance. There was no way someone could have left the area that quickly without me seeing them. The indigent section is surrounded by open ground on 3 sides and the back fence on the 4th. The nearest gate is 300 yards away. Even at a full sprint, they couldn't have made it. Unless they weren't running, unless they were never there. I went back to the office and reviewed the footage frame by frame. The figure appeared at 2:47 a.m., remained motionless for exactly 2 minutes, and then simply ceased to exist. No walking away, no fade out. One frame showed the figure standing there. The next frame showed empty space. I called my supervisor the next morning, explained what I'd been seeing. He came in that afternoon, reviewed the footage himself, and authorized a full technical inspection of camera 9. The technicians arrived the following day, tested the equipment, checked for glitches, examined the wiring. Everything was functioning normally. Could be lens flare, one of them suggested, or light reflecting off something in the distance. But lens flare doesn't appear at the same time every night, and it doesn't have a human shape. The alerts continued. Every night at 2:47 a.m., camera 9 would trigger. Every night, the figure would appear beside plot 87. I stopped responding after the first week. There was no point. Whoever or whatever I was seeing on camera wasn't physically present at the location, at least not when I arrived. But I kept watching the footage. On the ninth night, I noticed something I'd missed before. The flowers left by volunteers on the indigent graves were arranged differently after the figure appeared, not scattered or trampled, rearranged. They'd been placed in a circle around plot 87, like someone had carefully moved them while I was watching. I drove to the location the next morning during daylight and examined the grave. The flowers were still there, arranged in a perfect circle. I checked the footage from the previous night. The flowers had been in their usual scattered positions at 2:46 a.m. At 2:47 a.m., when the figure appeared, they were in a circle. I started documenting everything: timestamps, weather conditions, moon phase, any detail that might explain the pattern. I pulled the burial records for plot 87. The deceased was listed as Jane Doe, age unknown, found deceased in a vacant lot on the east side. No identification, no family, no one to claim her. She'd been buried 2 weeks before the first alert. I looked for any connection between the figure and the deceased, any reason someone would visit that specific grave at that specific time. I found nothing. The figure still appears. Every night at 2:47 a.m., standing beside plot 87, motionless and silent. I've stopped trying to intercept it. I just watch on the monitor, document the appearance, and review the footage the next morning. The flowers are always rearranged, always in a perfect circle. Last week, I decided to change my approach. Instead of driving to the location when the alert triggered, I stayed in the office and watched the feed continuously. I wanted to see what the figure did after I would normally have left to investigate. At 2:47 a.m., it appeared as usual, stood motionless for 2 minutes. Then, at 2:49 a.m., instead of disappearing, it turned its head, slowly, deliberately. It looked directly at camera 9, directly at me. The image pixelated for a moment, and when it cleared, the figure was gone. I reviewed the footage the next morning. Frame by frame, I watched the figure's head turn toward the camera, and in the last clear frame before the image distorted, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. The figure was holding something, flowers, maybe, or a small object, something it had been placing on the grave. I went to plot 87 during daylight. Inside the circle of flowers, there was a new addition, a single white lily, fresh and clean, resting on the center of the grave. I checked the volunteer logs. No one had visited the indigent section in 3 days. I still work the night shift at Oakwood. I still monitor the cameras and patrol the grounds. But I don't respond to alerts from camera 9 anymore. I just watch, document, and in every morning, I check plot 87 to see what's been left. Because I understand now that some visitors don't need gates to enter. They don't leave footprints. They don't appear on patrol routes or in daylight. They only exist in the 2-minute window between 2:47 and 2:49 a.m., standing side a grave with no name, rearranging flowers into perfect circles, leaving lilies for the forgotten, making sure someone remembers, even if no one else knows they're there. I've set hundreds of faces in my career, but only one changed its expression 3 times after I'd finished my work, and that smile still follows me. My name is Jude Brennan, and I have worked as a licensed embalmer at Riverside Funeral Home in Portland, Maine for 17 years. Setting a face is one of the most important aspects of preparation. You position the jaw, adjust the features, create a peaceful expression that families can remember. It's technical work that requires precision and respect. You set the expression once, and it stays that way. The muscles are treated, the tissue is prepared, nothing moves after you're finished. That's the science of it. That's what I believed until I prepared John Doe, number 23, and watched his face change 3 times in 3 days. The body arrived on a Monday morning in late November. Unclaimed, no identification. Found deceased in a shelter on Cumberland Avenue. The county would handle burial costs, and my job was to provide basic preparation, embalming, features setting, standard care, nothing elaborate, nothing complex. I began the preparation following standard procedures: external examination, arterial injection, drainage, tissue treatment. He was a thin man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and weathered skin. His face, when I started, was slack and neutral, the way faces always are before treatment. I worked carefully, following the process I'd performed the thousands of times before. Feature setting came last. I positioned the jaw carefully, used cotton and compound to fill out the cheeks slightly, and set his expression to neutral repose. Mouth closed, corners relaxed, no tension. Professional, dignified, peaceful. I checked my work from multiple angles, made minor adjustments, and documented the completion. His expression was neutral. I was certain of it. The county viewing was scheduled for Wednesday. No one would attend. They never did for unclaimed cases, but protocol required the opportunity. On Tuesday afternoon, I moved John Doe number 23 to Parlor C and positioned him in the county provided casket. We keep these simple, basic wood, minimal lining, functional but respectful. I opened the casket to do a final check before the viewing. That's when I saw it. His expression had changed. The corners of his mouth were pulled upward, not dramatically, not grotesquely, just slightly, like the beginning of a subtle smile. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. I'd set his features myself less than 24 hours ago. I'd documented the neutral expression. I'd checked it from every angle. I told myself it was tissue settling. Sometimes features shift slightly as the embalming fluid distributes and the tissues firm. It's uncommon with modern techniques, but it happens. I repositioned his mouth, applied additional compound, and reset the expression to neutral. Checked it carefully, documented it again. Wednesday morning, I opened the casket for the scheduled viewing. The smile was back. This time it was more pronounced. The corners of his mouth were lifted higher, creating a definite curve, not a grin, not something exaggerated, just a gentle, unmistakable smile, like he knew something I didn't. I called my supervisor, Dennis, who'd been working in the funeral industry for 30 years. He examined the body, checked my preparation work, and reviewed my documentation. Everything was correct. Everything was professional. He had no explanation for the change. Reset it, he said finally. If it happens again, we'll call the medical examiner. I reset the expression, used additional compound, applied extra tissue builder, made absolutely certain the mouth was neutral and secure. I photographed it from multiple angles before closing the casket. The viewing period was 2 hours. No one came. At noon, I entered the parlor to close the casket and prepare the body for transport to the cemetery. I opened the lid for the standard final check. The smile was wider, not a subtle curve anymore. A clear, deliberate smile, the kind of expression someone makes when they're genuinely pleased about something. The lips were pulled back slightly, showing the top edge of his teeth. The cheeks were lifted. The whole face had transformed. I stepped back from the casket. My hands were shaking. I'd been doing this work for 17 years. I'd prepared hundreds of bodies. I knew what was possible and what wasn't. Facial expressions don't change after feature setting. The muscles are treated with chemicals that prevent movement. The tissue is prepared to maintain position. Nothing about this was scientifically possible. I called Dennis back. He came to the parlor, looked at the body, and went pale. We stood there together, staring at that smile. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Close the casket, he said finally. Transport him. We're not resetting it again. I closed the casket, sealed it. The transport service picked up John Doe, number 23, that afternoon, and took him to Forest Hills Cemetery for burial. I logged the case as complete and tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about that smile. 3 days after the burial, I drove to Forest Hills during my lunch break. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to confirm he was actually buried. Maybe I needed to see the filled grave and know it was over. The cemetery groundskeeper directed me to the indigent section. Plot 41. The grave was filled. A temporary marker had been placed. Everything looked normal. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the disturbed earth, and then I turned to leave. That's when I saw the photograph. Someone had left a small framed photo beside the marker. I picked it up. It showed a young man, maybe in his 20s, smiling at the camera. Happy, healthy, alive. I turned the frame over. Written on the back in faded ink, James Garrett, 1967. I took the photo back to Riverside and asked Dennis if we had any records for a James Garrett. He searched the archives, found an intake from 2009. James Garrett, unclaimed, buried in Forest Hills Cemetery, Plot 41, the same plot where we just buried John Doe, number 23. The county clerk's office confirmed what I already suspected. Forest Hills had reused the plot. James Garrett's burial had been nearly 15 years ago, before the county started maintaining detailed records for indigent burials. When the plot came up in rotation again, no one had checked whether it was previously occupied. We'd buried John Doe number 23 on top of someone else. I reported it to the county. They opened an investigation. Forest Hills exhumed both caskets. John Doe number 23 was relocated to a different plot. James Garrett's remains were reinterred properly. The mix-up was documented, protocols were updated, and the case was closed. But before they moved him, before they opened John Doe's casket to transfer him, I asked the cemetery director one question. What did his expression look like? The director had been present for the exhumation. He'd seen the body. He looked at me for a long time before answering, smiling. He said quietly, "Biggest smile I've ever seen on a deceased." I don't work indigent cases anymore. I requested a transfer to family services only, cases where someone claims the body, where someone knows who they're burying. Dennis approved it without questions. He understood, because once you've seen a face change its expression 3 times, once you've watched neutral features transform into a smile that shouldn't exist, once you understand that the dead might know things we don't, like who they're being buried with or what they're returning to, you can't approach that work the same way. I still think about John Doe, number 23, about that smile, about James Garrett waiting in Plot 41 for 15 years. And I wonder if maybe, somehow, John Doe knew he wasn't going to be alone down there, knew he was going home to someone. And that's why he smiled. That's why his expression kept changing, getting wider, getting happier as he got closer to burial, because he was finally going somewhere he belonged, even if no one alive knew where that was. I saw a mourner weeping at the graveside during a pauper's burial where no one had registered to attend, but the security cameras showed I was standing there alone, speaking to empty air. My name is Teresa Santos, and I have worked as a funeral director at Blessed Shepherd Memorial in San Antonio, Texas, for 21 years. Conducting services is the heart of what I do, coordinating with families, arranging ceremonies, providing comfort during grief. Most services are attended. People come to say goodbye. But paupers' burials are different. The county schedules them, pays the basic costs, and provides a simple graveside service for those who die with no family or resources to claim them. Usually, I'm the only one who attends. Me, the priest, and the groundskeeper. That's how it's always been, until I conducted the burial for Thomas Wright and saw someone who couldn't have been there. The service was scheduled for a Friday morning in early October. Thomas Wright, age 68, found deceased in a boarding house on the west side. No family located, no emergency contacts, no one to claim him. The county provided standard services, basic embalming, simple casket, graveside service at Blessed Shepherd's Indigent section. Father Miguel would say the prayers. I would coordinate. The groundskeeper would fill the grave afterward, simple, respectful, quiet. I arrived at the gravesite at 9:30 a.m. to ensure everything was prepared. The grave was open, the casket positioned on the lowering device. I placed a small arrangement of white roses beside the grave, something I do for every pauper's burial, a small gesture to honor the deceased. Father Miguel arrived at 9:45. We reviewed the order of service. The burial was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 9:55, I noticed him. A man in worn clothes was walking slowly through the cemetery, heading toward our location. He was elderly, maybe 70 or 75, dressed in a faded jacket and khaki pants. His face was weathered, his hair gray and uncombed. He walked with difficulty, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. I approached him as he neared the gravesite. "Excuse me, sir, are you here for the right service?" He nodded but didn't speak. His eyes were red, wet with tears. "Did you know Thomas?" He looked at me for a long moment, then turned his attention to the casket. A tear rolled down his cheek. He wiped it away with a shaking hand. I guided him to one of the folding chairs I'd set up beside the grave. "Please sit. The service will begin shortly." He sat down slowly, gripping his cane, staring at the casket. I returned to my position beside Father Miguel and whispered that we had one attendee. He nodded and prepared to begin. The service was brief. Father Miguel read the standard prayers, spoke about eternal rest, and the dignity of all souls regardless of circumstance. I watched the elderly man during the reading. He sat perfectly still, tears streaming down his face, never taking his eyes from the casket. When Father Miguel finished, the man stood, walked slowly to the grave, and placed his hand on the casket. He stayed there for a long time, just standing, palm flat against the wood, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. I didn't interrupt. Grief takes its own time. After several minutes, he stepped back, wiped his eyes, and turned to leave. I walked with him part way, offering condolences. "I'm sorry for your loss. Were you and Thomas close?" He stopped walking, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brothers," he said. Then he continued walking, disappearing slowly into the rows of headstones toward the cemetery parking lot. I returned to the gravesite. Father Miguel had left. The groundskeeper was preparing to lower the casket. I signed the burial completion forms and drove back to the funeral home. That afternoon, I received a call from Linda, the cemetery's operations manager. She'd been reviewing the morning's security footage for the monthly report and noticed something unusual. Could I come back to the cemetery to review it with her? I arrived an hour later. Linda led me to the security office and pulled up the footage from camera 12, which covers the indigent burial section. The timestamp showed 9:45 a.m. when Father Miguel and I were setting up for the service. "Watch this," Linda said, starting the playback. The video showed the gravesite. I could see myself placing the roses, Father Miguel reviewing his notes. At 9:57, I walked away from my position. On the video, it looked like I was approaching someone, though no one was visible in the frame. I appeared to be speaking to empty air. "Stop," I said. "Rewind that." Linda rewound the footage. We watched again. At 9:57, I clearly walked toward what should have been the elderly man on approaching the grave. But on camera, there was no one, just me, walking across the frame, gesturing as if guiding someone to a chair, then returning to my position beside Father Miguel. "Keep playing," I whispered. The service proceeded. Father Miguel read the prayers. On camera, I stood beside him, watching the empty chairs. At one point, the moment I remembered the man standing and walking to the casket, the video showed me standing alone, looking at the chairs as if watching someone move. But the chairs were empty. No one approached the grave. No one placed their hand on the casket. When the service ended, the video showed me walking partway through the cemetery, appearing to accompany someone who wasn't there. Then I stopped, stood still for a moment, as if listening, and returned to the gravesite alone. "Teresa," Linda said quietly, "there was no one at that burial except you and Father Miguel." I stared at the screen. I saw him. I spoke to him. He was crying. He told me he and Thomas were brothers. Linda pulled up the intake records for Thomas Wright. According to the county, Wright had no living relatives, both parents deceased, no siblings listed, no emergency contacts. "Check the archived records," I said. "Go back further." Linda searched. It took 20 minutes, but she found something. A death certificate from 1998. Robert Wright, age 34. Cause of death, complications from pneumonia. Next of kin listed, Thomas Wright, brother. Thomas had a brother, had. Robert had been dead for 25 years. I asked Linda to pull up the video again. We watched the entire service in silence. At the moment, I remembered the man placing his hand on the casket. I watched myself on camera standing beside the grave, looking down at the casket, as if witnessing something profound. But I was alone, completely alone. "What do you want to do?" Linda asked. I didn't know what to tell her. I'd seen him, spoken to him, watched him weep, felt his grief as real and present as my own, but the camera showed only empty space where he'd stood. I drove back to Blessed Shepherd and pulled Thomas Wright's guest registry from the service files. Every burial, even paupers' burials, has a registry where attendees can sign their names. I'd placed it on the small table beside the folding chairs, standard procedure. I opened it. One signature, written in shaky handwriting, barely legible. Robert Wright. I called Linda back, told her about the signature. She asked me to bring the registry to the cemetery. When I arrived, she was waiting with the archived records for Robert Wright's funeral from 1998. We compared the signatures. They matched. Identical handwriting, same formation, same pressure, same signature he'd used on his own funeral registry 25 years ago. Linda locked the registry in the cemetery archives. Neither of us filed an official report. What would we say? That a dead man had attended his brother's burial? That security cameras don't capture ghosts? That grief transcends death? I still conduct paupers' burials. I still set up folding chairs and place flowers and speak prayers over the unclaimed. But now, when I see the empty chairs, I wonder if they're really empty. I wonder if there are mourners I can't see on camera, people who cross whatever boundary separates the living from the dead to say one final goodbye. I check the guest registries more carefully now. Sometimes there are signatures I don't remember witnessing, names I don't recognize, handwriting that matches archived records from decades ago. And sometimes, when I'm standing at a graveside conducting a service for someone who died alone, I feel a presence beside me, someone watching, someone weeping, someone who loved the deceased enough to return, even if no one alive can see them. I don't mention it to the families, I don't point it out to the clergy. I just continue the service, acknowledge the presence silently, and trust that those who need to be there find a way. Because I learned that October morning that attendance isn't always visible, that love doesn't end with death, that some mourners exist in the space between cameras and reality, in the gap between what we can see and what we know is true. And when I conduct a pauper's burial now, when I'm standing beside an open grave in the indigent section where no one comes and no one mourns, I always set up one extra chair, just in case someone is there, someone the cameras can't see, someone who came to say goodbye. I found a grave with no name and no date in the digital archives, just GPS coordinates pointing to a plot that supposedly was never used. And when I visited the site, I heard breathing from beneath the ground. My name is Claire Voss, and I have worked as a records clerk at Evergreen Hills Cemetery in Birmingham, Alabama for 9 years. My job is to maintain the burial database, digitizing old records, updating plot information, ensuring every grave is properly documented. It's meticulous work that requires attention to detail and patience. Most days, I sit at my desk scanning ledgers from the 1890s and entering data into our system. The work is quiet, methodical, and predictable until I found the entry that shouldn't exist. I was digitizing records from Section 12, the oldest part of the cemetery, when I came across a handwritten entry in a ledger from 1947. Most entries followed a standard format: name, date of death, plot number, burial date. But this one was different. There was no name, no date of death, just a set of GPS coordinates written in faded ink, and beside them, a single word, unmarked. I'd never seen an entry like that before. Every grave in our cemetery has a name. Even the indigent burials, even the unidentified remains, get assigned a John Doe or Jane Doe designation. But this entry had nothing, just coordinates and that one word. I entered the coordinates into our mapping system to see which plot it referenced. The system processed for a moment, then returned an error. No plot found at specified location. I double-checked the coordinates, entered them again. Same error. I pulled up the cemetery's master plot map and manually located the coordinates. They pointed to an area in section 12 between rows 7 and 8. According to our current records, that area had never been developed. It was marked as future expansion in the database, designated as unused green space. But the ledger said otherwise. Someone had been buried there in 1947. I brought the ledger to my supervisor, Margaret, who'd worked at Evergreen Hills for 23 years. She examined the entry, checked the coordinates herself, and frowned. That section was never used for burials, she said. It's too close to the drainage system. We've always kept it clear. But the ledger might be wrong. Someone could have made an error in 1947. These old records aren't always accurate. She suggested I mark it as a historical discrepancy and move on. But something about the entry bothered me. The handwriting was too careful, too deliberate, and that word, unmarked, felt intentional, like a warning rather than a description. I decided to visit the site during my lunch break. The coordinates led me to a quiet corner of Section 12, shaded by old oak trees and surrounded by weathered headstones from the 1930s and 40s. The ground between rows 7 and 8 was covered in thick grass, undisturbed, with no indication anyone had ever been buried there. I walked the area slowly, looking for any sign of a grave, a depression in the earth, a sunken patch, anything. That's when I noticed the ground felt wrong. I knelt down and pressed my palm against the grass. The earth was soft, looser than the surrounding area. I pulled back some of the grass and saw soil that looked darker, richer, like it had been disturbed more recently than the rest of the section. I cleared more grass away and found a subtle rectangular outline in the ground, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. A grave-sized depression. I stood up and checked the coordinates again. This was the exact location. Someone was buried here, despite what our current records claimed. I took photos, marked the location with my phone's GPS, and returned to the office. I spent the afternoon searching through archived records, looking for any mention of burials in that area. I found nothing. No death certificates, no burial permits, no plot sales, but the ledger entry remained, undeniable and unexplained. Someone had written those coordinates. Someone had marked it as unmarked. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, I drove back to Evergreen Hills. I parked near the maintenance building and walked through the cemetery with a flashlight, following the path to Section 12. The area was silent, except for the rustle of wind through the oak trees. I stood over the rectangular depression and listened. At first, I heard nothing, just wind, just the distant sound of traffic on Highway 28. Then, beneath those sounds, I heard something else, something rhythmic and low, something that sounded like breathing. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground. The breathing was clearer now, slow, deliberate, like someone sleeping or waiting. I jerked back, my heart pounding, and swept my flashlight across the area. Nothing, no one, but the breathing continued. I ran back to my car and didn't return to the cemetery until the next morning. When I arrived at work, I went straight to Margaret's office and told her everything. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but she agreed to authorize a ground survey of the area. The survey crew arrived 2 days later with ground-penetrating radar. They scanned the location I'd marked. The results came back within an hour. There was a void beneath the surface, approximately 6 feet down, consistent with a burial site. And inside the void, the radar detected an object with density patterns matching a wooden casket. Someone was buried there. The coordinates were correct. The ledger entry was real. Margaret authorized a limited excavation to identify the burial and update our records. The groundskeeping crew arrived the following morning and began carefully removing soil from the depression. 3 hours later, They uncovered the edge of a casket. It was old, the wood dark and partially rotted, but intact. There was no nameplate, no brass handles, nothing to identify who was inside. Just plain wood and a layer of earth that had accumulated over decades. The crew lifted the casket carefully and set it on the grass beside the excavation. Margaret called the county medical examiner, who arrived that afternoon to supervise the opening. I stood at a distance, watching as they unsealed the lid. Inside was a skeleton, dressed in deteriorated fabric, hands folded across the chest. But there was no identification, no jewelry, no personal effects, nothing to indicate who this person had been. The medical examiner took samples for analysis and cataloged the remains. The preliminary assessment suggested the burial dated to the 1940s, consistent with the ledger entry. But here's what I couldn't explain. When the casket was opened, when the seal was broken and the lid lifted, I heard the breathing stop. That rhythmic, deliberate sound I'd heard 2 nights earlier. It simply ceased the moment the casket was exposed to air. The medical examiner sent the remains to the state lab for identification. 3 weeks later, the results came back. The DNA didn't match anyone in the system. No missing person reports, no historical records, no family connections. Whoever had been buried in that unmarked grave had no documented existence before death and no identity after. We reinterred the remains in the same location, this time with proper documentation. The plot was officially registered as Grave 12A, and we placed a small marker with the inscription Unknown 1940s. But in my records, in the digital file I created for that burial, I included the original ledger entry, the coordinates, the single word, unmarked. I still work at Evergreen Hills, maintaining records and digitizing archives, but I don't visit Section 12 anymore. I don't walk between rows 7 and 8. And when I come across unusual entries in old ledgers, graves without names, burials without dates, coordinates that don't match current maps, I don't investigate them alone, because I learned that some graves are unmarked for a reason. Some burials are meant to be forgotten, and some sounds, like breathing from beneath the earth, aren't meant to be heard by the living. The ledger had warned me. Unmarked, not just unnamed, unmarked, as in, don't mark it, don't document it, don't draw attention to it, don't disturb what's buried there. I should have listened. I record my transport routes for insurance purposes, but when I played back yesterday's drive, I heard a voice that wasn't mine whispering an address I'd never been to, until I drove there and found where the John Doe I'd transported had died alone. My name is Jennifer Kim, and I have worked as a body transport driver for Mercy Memorial Services in Seattle, Washington, for 6 years. My job is straightforward. Pick up deceased individuals from hospitals, care facilities, or private residences and transport them to funeral homes or morgues. I keep detailed logs, document mileage, and record my routes using a dashboard camera. The recordings serve as proof of proper handling and provide protection in case of accidents or disputes. In 6 years, I'd reviewed maybe a dozen recordings, usually for paperwork verification. I never expected one to reveal something I couldn't explain. The pickup was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Harborview Medical Center. John Doe, age approximately 70, found deceased in a downtown motel, transferred to the hospital morgue for identification. No family located. The county medical examiner had released the body for transport to the mortuary for preparation and eventual burial in Potter's Field. I arrived at Harborview at 3:45 p.m., signed the transfer paperwork, and loaded the body into my van. Standard procedure. The deceased was in a black vinyl bag, properly tagged and documented. I secured the gurney, closed the rear doors, and started the drive to Mercy Memorial. The route took approximately 30 minutes through downtown Seattle traffic. I drove carefully, following protocols, maintaining appropriate speed. The dashboard camera recorded continuously, audio and video, as it always did. Nothing about the transport seemed unusual. I delivered the body to Mercy Memorial at 4:20 p.m., signed the receiving forms, and returned to the office. That evening, I was completing my daily reports when I realized I'd forgotten to log the exact arrival time at Mercy Memorial. I pulled up the dashboard camera recording to verify the timestamp. The video showed my drive through downtown, street views, traffic lights, the usual route. I fast forwarded to the arrival at Mercy Memorial, noted the time, and was about to close the file when I heard something in the audio that made me stop. A voice, not mine, whispering. I rewound the recording and turned up the volume. At timestamp 4:07 p.m., 13 minutes into the drive, I heard it clearly. A male voice, hoarse and strained, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I played it again, adjusting the audio levels. 317 Bourne Avenue. I felt cold. That voice hadn't been in the van. I'd been alone during the transport. The deceased was in the back, sealed in a body bag. There was no one else, but the audio was clear. Someone had whispered that address. I checked the recording equipment. No malfunctions, no cross-channel interference. The timestamp showed exactly when the voice had occurred, 4:07 p.m., approximately halfway through my route along Madison Street. I pulled up a map and searched for the address. 317 Bourne Avenue. It was an old building in the First Hill neighborhood, about 6 blocks from where I'd been driving when the voice appeared on the recording. I'd never been to that address, had no reason to know it. I called my supervisor, Michael, and explained what I'd found. He listened to the recording himself, heard the whispered address, and suggested it might be radio interference or a crossed signal from another vehicle. But the voice was too clear, too close to the microphone. It sounded like someone sitting in my passenger seat. I went home that night and tried to forget about it. But at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, I got in my car and drove to Bourne Avenue. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to confirm the address was real. Maybe I needed to understand why that voice had whispered those specific coordinates. The building at 317 Bourne Avenue was abandoned. 4 stories, windows boarded, a condemned notice posted on the front door. It looked like it had been empty for years. I sat in my car across the street, staring at the structure, trying to make sense of what I'd heard on the recording. Then I saw the sign, partially visible through overgrown shrubs, faded and weathered. Boren Care Facility, Residential Assisted Living. I took a photo and drove home. The next morning, I searched public records for the building. Boren Care Facility had closed in 2015 after multiple code violations and neglect citations. The property had been vacant since then, ownership transferred through various holding companies, none of which had attempted renovation or demolition. I pulled up the intake file for the John Doe I'd transported the previous day. The county report stated he'd been found deceased in a downtown motel, the Cascade Inn on 3rd Avenue. Cause of death, natural causes, likely cardiac arrest, no identification, no personal effects except $14 in cash, and a plastic room key. But there was a note in the file I'd missed during the initial review. Under prior residence, someone had written, believed to have resided at Boren Care Facility prior to 2015, unable to confirm. The John Doe had lived at 317 Boren Avenue, the same address whispered on my dashboard recording, the same building I'd driven past at 2 a.m. I contacted the county social services department and asked if they had any records for residents of Boren Care Facility. They searched their archives and found a partial roster from 2014, 1 year before closure. The list included 17 names, but several entries were incomplete or illegible due to poor record keeping. None of the names matched the John Doe I'd transported, but the county clerk noted that many residents of the facility during its final years had been transient, with minimal documentation. Some had left without notice. Some had simply disappeared when the facility closed. I drove back to Boren Avenue that afternoon, parked in the same spot across the street, stared at the building and wondered how many people had lived there, died there, been forgotten there, wondered if John Doe had been one of them, wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something. I played the dashboard recording again that evening, listened to that whispered voice. 317 Boren Avenue. And this time, I heard something else beneath the words. Something that sounded like longing, like recognition, like someone remembering home. The county buried John Doe, number 43, 3 days later in Section 9 of Riverside Cemetery. I didn't attend. I had another transport scheduled, another John Doe from another location. But I thought about him, about that whispered address, about the abandoned building on Boren Avenue where he might have spent his final years before ending up alone in a downtown motel. I still record my transport routes, still maintain detailed logs, and save the dashboard camera files. But now, when I review the recordings, I listen carefully to the audio, especially during transports of unidentified individuals, unclaimed bodies, people who died alone with no family and no history. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm completing my reports, I hear things on those recordings. Whispered addresses, fragments of names, coordinates that lead to places the deceased once knew, voices that shouldn't exist speaking words only they would know. And when I hear them, I don't dismiss them as interference or equipment malfunction. I write down the addresses, I visit the locations, I document what I find because I learned that the dead sometimes remember what the living have forgotten, that some voices carry messages we're meant to hear, that the last thing someone might want, even after death, is to tell you where they belonged, where they came from, where they should have been buried if anyone had known, if anyone had been listening. I keep those recordings archived separately now, the ones with whispered addresses, with voices that don't belong to the living. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with them. Don't know if documenting these moments makes any difference. But I listen every time, and I drive to those addresses, and I remember that John Doe number 43 wasn't just a number. He was someone who once lived at 317 Bourne Avenue, someone who wanted me to know, someone who whispered his way home, even if he never made it back there alive. I logged an unclaimed body as number 14 for the county burial, but when the priest read the tag aloud at the graveside, he paused. There was a second number beneath it, older and handwritten, dated 1987, and the previous John Doe number 14 was never found. My name is Raymond Carter, and I have worked as a coroner's assistant at King County Medical Examiner's Office in Seattle, Washington for 13 years. My responsibilities include logging deceased individuals, maintaining chain of custody, and preparing bodies for autopsy or release. Every unidentified person who comes through our facility receives a sequential number, John Doe 1, John Doe 2, and so on. We reset the count each year on January 1st. The system is simple, efficient, and has worked without issue for decades. Until I logged John Doe number 14 in late October and discovered he wasn't the first. The body arrived on a Thursday evening. Male, approximate age 65, found deceased in an abandoned warehouse south of downtown. No identification, no personal effects, no distinguishing features beyond a scar on his left forearm. The responding officers estimated he'd been dead for 3 to 4 days. Cause of death appeared to be exposure and malnutrition, but an autopsy would confirm. I began the standard intake procedure, photographing the body, documenting physical characteristics, collecting any trace evidence for the detectives. Then I assigned the case number. We'd processed 13 John Does already that year, so this one became John Doe number 14. I filled out the identification tag, attached it to the body's right toe, and logged him in our database. Everything was routine, standard procedure. Nothing unusual about the case, except how unremarkable it was. Another unclaimed person, another anonymous death, another burial in Potter's Field after the required holding period. The autopsy was scheduled for Friday morning. I prepared the examination room, reviewed the case file, and assisted Dr. Patterson with the procedure. The examination confirmed the preliminary assessment: death by exposure, complicated by severe malnutrition and dehydration. No evidence of foul play. No identifying marks beyond the scar I'd already documented. Dr. Patterson completed her report, and I returned the body to cold storage. 3 weeks later, the county cleared John Doe 14 for burial. No one had come forward to identify him. No missing person reports matched his description. The required holding period had elapsed. I prepared the release paperwork and scheduled transport to Greenwood Memorial for the county burial service. The transport occurred on a Tuesday morning. I accompanied the body to ensure proper chain of custody and to witness the burial for our records. The service was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Section 12, the Indigent burial area. When I arrived, Father Michaels was already present, along with the cemetery's funeral director and a groundskeeper. The casket was positioned beside the open grave. Father Michaels began the standard prayers, and I stood at a respectful distance observing. Halfway through the service, Father Michaels approached the casket to read the identification tag aloud, a practice he followed for all unclaimed burials, speaking the person's assigned name, even if their true identity remained unknown. He knelt beside the casket and read the tag. Then he stopped, stared at it for a long moment, looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "could you come here, please?" I approached the casket. Father Michaels pointed to the identification tag attached to the body's right toe, visible through the partially open casket. The tag read, John Doe, number 14, October 2024, in my handwriting. But beneath that, written in faded ink, was a second line I hadn't seen before. JD, number 14 1987. I knelt down and examined the tag more closely. The second line was definitely there. Older ink, different handwriting, partially obscured by the newer tag, but still visible. Someone had written JD, number 14 1987 on that same tag, or on a tag that had been beneath mine 37 years ago. That wasn't possible. We used fresh tags for every intake. I'd filled out this tag myself 3 weeks ago. There was no underlying tag, no previous marking. I was certain, but the writing was there, clear enough to read. JD number 14 1987. I asked Father Michaels to pause the service while I called the medical examiner's office. I spoke with our records manager, Sharon, and asked her to pull any files we had for John Doe cases from 1987. She searched the archives and called me back 20 minutes later. We had a John Doe number 14 in 1987, she said. Male, approximate age 60, found deceased in an abandoned warehouse, never identified, scheduled for county burial, but she paused. The file says the body went missing from cold storage before the burial could take place. Missing. According to the notes, they logged him out for transport to the cemetery, but he never arrived. The transport driver claimed he'd loaded the body, but when they opened the vehicle at the cemetery, it was empty. No sign of the casket or the body, no evidence of theft, just gone. I stood there beside the open grave, staring at the tag with its two numbers. What was the cause of death for the 1907 case? Sharon checked the file. Exposure and malnutrition, the same as the current John Doe 14, same approximate location, same age range, same cause of death, and now, somehow, the same identification number appearing on the same tag. I asked Sharon to send me any photos from the 1987 case. She found two images in the archived file, intake photos showing the deceased's face and identifying marks. She transmitted them to my phone. When I opened the images, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The man in the photos had a scar on his left forearm, the same scar I'd documented on John Doe 14 3 weeks ago. Same location, same pattern, same appearance. I showed the photos to Father Michaels. He examined them, compared them to the body in the casket, and made the sign of the cross. It's the same person, he said. But that wasn't possible. The man in the casket had been dead for 3 weeks. The man in the photos had been dead for 37 years. They couldn't be the same person, unless the body that went missing from cold storage in 1987 had somehow returned. Unless John Doe 14 had been waiting all this time to be buried. Unless he'd never really disappeared, just been delayed. Father Michaels completed the service. We lowered the casket into the grave. The groundskeeper filled it. I documented everything in my report, including the discovery of the second number on the tag, but I didn't include my theory. I didn't speculate about impossible timelines or bodies that age backward or disappearances that reverse themselves. I just noted the facts. 2 John Doe, 14. Same year sequence, different calendar years. Same scar, same cause of death, same warehouse. One went missing, one was buried. When I returned to the medical examiner's office, I went to the archives and pulled the physical file for the 1987 case. The identification tag from that case was still there, preserved in an evidence envelope. I opened it carefully and examined the tag. It was blank on the reverse side, no number, no date, no marking. But I knew what would appear there if I checked it in 37 years. I knew what someone would find in 2061 when they logged their John Doe 14 and discovered a second number beneath it, dated 2024. Because time doesn't move in straight lines for everyone. Some people get lost in the gaps, in the spaces between 1 year and another. Some bodies disappear and return decades later, unchanged, except for a tag that bears witness to both arrivals. I still work at the medical examiner's office. I still log John Doe's and assign sequential numbers. But now, when I attach an identification tag, I check the reverse side first. I make sure there's nothing written there, nothing dated from another year, nothing that suggests the person I'm logging has been here before. Because I learned that some cases don't close. Some disappearances don't have endings. Some bodies return to finish what was started decades ago, carrying tags that document journeys we're not meant to understand. And when I logged John Doe 14 that October, I didn't just catalog one death. I completed 2, 37 years apart. The same person, finally buried, finally found. A grave in Potter's Field always has fresh flowers, though no one visits it, but they rotate through the seasons in reverse. In July, I find December holly, and by December, I find spring lilacs still blooming in the snow. My name is Alice Crawford, and I have worked as a groundskeeper at Willow Grove Cemetery in Burlington, Vermont for 15 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the grounds, trimming vegetation, and ensuring the cemetery remains respectful and well kept. Part of that work involves removing wilted flowers from graves, replacing them when families request it, and documenting which plots receive regular visitors. Most graves in our main sections get weekly or monthly visits, families bringing fresh arrangements, leaving mementos, maintaining their connection to the deceased. But Potter's Field is different. The indigent section receives few visitors, and those who do come rarely return. In 15 years, I've never seen the same person visit Potter's Field twice. Except for the flowers at Plot 37, they're always fresh, always seasonal, and always wrong. I first noticed them in July, 3 years ago. I was trimming the grass in Potter's Field, working my way through the rows of simple white crosses that mark the county burials. Most plots were bare, no flowers, no decorations, nothing to suggest anyone remembered the person buried there. But Plot 37 had a small bouquet of holly sprigs, bright red berries against dark green leaves, arranged carefully at the base of the cross. Holly in July, Christmas flowers in midsummer. I assumed someone had left artificial decorations and forgotten to remove them. But when I picked up the bouquet to dispose of it, the stems were fresh, the leaves were supple, the berries were firm and newly grown. These weren't old decorations, they were fresh cut holly, maybe a day old at most. I checked the volunteer log to see if anyone had visited Potter's Field recently. No entries. I asked the cemetery office if a family had requested flower placement at Plot 37. No requests on file. The plot belonged to a Jane Doe buried 4 years earlier. No one had ever come to visit. I left the holly where I'd found it and continued my work. In August, the holly was gone. In its place was a small bundle of asters, purple and white autumn flowers, perfectly fresh, arranged in the same careful way. Asters in August, fall flowers in late summer. I documented it in my daily log and moved on. By September, the pattern became clear. The flowers at Plot 37 changed monthly, always fresh, always seasonal, but the seasons they represented were moving backward. September brought sunflowers and black-eyed Susans, late summer blooms. October brought wild roses and lavender, midsummer flowers. November brought daffodils and crocuses, early spring blooms. The flowers were rotating through the year in reverse. I started photographing them, documenting each change. December brought tulips and hyacinth, mid-spring flowers appearing in Vermont winter, arranged in snow. January brought cherry blossoms, delicate pink petals that shouldn't exist in sub-zero temperatures. February brought peonies and irises, late spring blooms appearing during the coldest month of the year, and they were always alive, always fresh, never wilted, never frozen, never damaged by weather. I reported it to the cemetery director, Mr. Holloway, who'd managed Willow Grove for 26 years. He examined the flowers himself, confirmed they were real and fresh, and had no explanation. He authorized me to remove them, to document who returned them, to install a small trail camera aimed at the plot. I removed the peonies on a Tuesday morning in late February. By Wednesday morning, they were back. The camera showed nothing, no visitors, no movement, just an empty frame at 9 p.m. and the same frame at 6 a.m. with flowers that hadn't been there before. By March, the rotation continued. Lilacs appeared, early summer blooms in early spring. April brought marigolds and zinnias, midsummer flowers. May brought asters again. We'd completed one full reverse cycle through the seasons. And then it started over. June brought holly. July brought asters. The rotation continued, unchanging, unstoppable. I stopped trying to remove them. Instead, I documented them, photographed them weekly, and tried to understand the pattern. Why reverse? Why plot 37? Why this specific Jane Doe? I pulled the burial records. Jane Doe, approximate age 50, found deceased in a city park in late autumn 4 years ago. No identification, no personal effects, except a small notebook filled with pressed flowers. The notebook had been cataloged as evidence and stored with her intake file. I requested access to the evidence. Mr. Holloway authorized it, and I examined the notebook at the county clerk's office. It was a simple composition book, the kind students use for class notes. Inside were dozens of pressed flowers, each labeled with a month but no year. December, holly. November, asters. October, sunflowers. September, wild roses. August, lavender. The sequence matched exactly what I'd been finding at plot 37, but the notebook showed the flowers in chronological order, December to November, moving backward through the year, like she'd been pressing flowers in reverse seasonal order, like she'd been documenting something that moved opposite to time. The final page of the notebook had a handwritten note. When the cycle completes, I'll know the way home. I closed the notebook and returned it to evidence. Drove back to Willow Grove and stood at plot 37 for a long time, staring at the fresh lilacs that had appeared overnight in late November, blooming impossibly in the snow. The cycle had been running for 3 years, 12 months per rotation, 36 months total, 3 complete cycles through the seasons in reverse. If the pattern held, the cycle would complete in December, 4 years after Jane Doe's burial, 4 years after she'd died in the park, with a notebook full of pressed flowers and a cryptic note about finding her way home. December arrived. On the first morning of the month, I walked to plot 37, expecting to find holly, the flower that started each reverse cycle. Instead, I found something different. The plot was covered in flowers, not a small bouquet. Hundreds of flowers, every type I documented over the past 3 years, arranged in concentric circles around the cross. Holly, asters, sunflowers, roses, lavender, daffodils, crocuses, tulips, hyacinth, cherry blossoms, peonies, irises, lilacs, marigolds, zinnias, all of them fresh, all of them blooming simultaneously, covering the grave in a cascade of impossible color. I stood there for an hour, taking photos, documenting what I was seeing. Then, around noon, something changed. The flowers began to wilt, not gradually, simultaneously. Within minutes, the entire arrangement had browned and died, leaving nothing but dried petals scattered across the snow. I knelt down and touched them. They crumbled to dust in my hands. The next morning, Plot 37 was bare. No flowers, no decorations, nothing. I checked every day for a week. The plot remained empty. No new flowers appeared. The rotation had stopped. I pulled the evidence log for Jane Doe's intake file. According to the records, the notebook with pressed flowers had been checked out 2 days before the cycle completed. Checked out by whom? The log didn't say. Just a signature I couldn't read and a date. The notebook was never returned. I still work at Willow Grove. I still maintain the grounds and document the plots, but I don't work Potter's Field alone anymore. I bring someone with me, just to witness, just to confirm I'm not imagining what I see. Because Plot 37 is bare now, has been for 8 months. No flowers appear, no seasonal rotations, just an empty grave with a white cross and a name, Jane Doe, that no one ever learned. But sometimes, when I'm trimming grass near Potter's Field in the evening, just as the light is fading, I see something at Plot 37, a shimmer in the air, a distortion, like heat waves in summer, even in winter, like something is opening, like something deflated its cycle and found the way home. And I wonder if that's what the reverse rotation was. Not flowers appearing, but flowers remembering, moving backward through time to the moment before death, to the seasons before the park, to the home she'd been trying to find by retracing the year in reverse, one petal at a time, one season at a time, until the cycle completed and the door opened, and she finally went home. I moved an unclaimed body to Section K, the indigent area, and heard the deceased's intake voice recording play on loop in the office that night. His last words to the hospital were, "I'm not going back there," and Section K was built over an old asylum cemetery. My name is Daniel Hale, and I have worked as a funeral director at Crossroads Memorial in Traverse City, Michigan, for 24 years. My responsibilities include coordinating services, managing facilities, and overseeing the preparation and placement of the deceased. We serve families from across 3 counties, handling everything from elaborate memorial services to simple county burials. Section K is our indigent burial area, located on the western edge of the property, established 15 years ago when we expanded our grounds. It's a quiet section, well maintained, with simple markers and minimal landscaping. What I didn't know when we developed Section K, what none of us knew, was what had been buried there before. The intake came on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. County transfer. John Doe, approximate age 75, found deceased at a bus station downtown. No identification, no personal effects. The hospital had recorded a brief verbal statement before he'd lost consciousness, standard procedure for unidentified patients. The recording was included in the transfer file, a requirement for chain of custody documentation. I logged the intake, assigned a case number, and prepared the necessary paperwork. The county burial was scheduled for Friday morning in Section K, Plot 83. Standard indigent service, no family, no viewing, just a graveside commitment with Father Stevens officiating. Before filing the paperwork, I listened to the hospital's voice recording to ensure it was properly documented. The quality was poor, recorded on a nurse's phone in a noisy emergency room. But the deceased's words were clear enough. "I'm not going back there," he'd said. His voice was strained, desperate. "You can't make me go back. Not to that place, not ever." The nurse had asked where he meant. What place? But he'd lost consciousness before answering. Those were his last words. I noted it in the file and moved on with the preparations. The body was embalmed, dressed in donated clothing, and placed in a simple county-provided casket. Everything proceeded normally. Thursday evening, I transported the casket to Section K and positioned it beside the grave that had been prepared that afternoon. I locked the cemetery gates at 7 p.m. and returned to the funeral home office to complete paperwork. Around 9:30 p.m., as I was finalizing the service schedule for the next day, I heard something that made me freeze at my desk. A voice playing through the office speaker system. "I'm not going back there. You can't make me go back. Not to that place, not ever." It was the hospital recording, the deceased's last words, playing on loop, repeating every few seconds, echoing through the empty building. I checked the computer. I hadn't opened the audio file. I hadn't accessed any recordings. But the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent with each repetition. "I'm not going back there. I'm not going back there. I'm not going back there." I shut down the computer. The voice didn't stop. It came from the speakers, from the walls, from everywhere and nowhere. I unplugged the speaker system. The voice continued, now seeming to come from the hallway, from the preparation rooms, from the storage area. I left the building and stood in the parking lot, breathing hard. Through the windows, I could see the lights inside flickering. The voice was still audible, muffled, but persistent, repeating those same wuzzas over and over. I called our building maintenance supervisor, Paul, who arrived 30 minutes later. We entered the funeral home together. The voice had stopped, the lights were stable. Everything appeared normal. Paul checked the electrical system, tested the speakers, found nothing unusual. I showed him the audio file on my computer, explained what I'd heard. He listened politely, but clearly thought I'd been working too long, had played the recording myself, and forgotten. He left around 11 p.m. I was alone again. The voice started immediately. "I'm not going back there." This time, I didn't run. I sat at my desk and tried to understand what was happening. The deceased's last words, playing on loop. "I'm not going back there." To where? Back where? I pulled up the property records for Section K, something I should have reviewed when we first developed the area 15 years ago. The land had been purchased from the county in 2009, listed as undeveloped green space. But the historical survey showed something different. Section K had been part of the grounds for Northwoods State Hospital, a psychiatric institution that operated from 1897 to 1973. When the hospital closed, the buildings were demolished, but the land remained county property until we purchased it. I searched deeper, found archived documents about the hospital. Northwoods had maintained a cemetery on its western grounds for patients who died during treatment and had no family to claim them. The cemetery had been unmarked, unconsecrated, forgotten after the hospital's closure. No records indicated the graves had ever been relocated. Section K was built directly over the asylum cemetery. We'd been burying indigent cases on top of forgotten psychiatric patients for 15 years. The voice grew louder. I'm not going back there, not to that place. I understood then the deceased knew. Somehow, even in death, he knew where we were taking him. Back to the asylum grounds. Back to a place he'd spent time before, maybe as a patient, maybe as staff, maybe as a visitor, back to Northwoods. And he didn't want to go. I drove to Section K that night, parked near Plot 83, where the casket waited for morning burial. The cemetery was dark, silent, except for the wind through the pines. I stood beside the open grave and listened. The voice was there too, quieter, but present. I'm not going back there, coming from the casket, or from the ground, or from everywhere in Section K at once. I called Father Stevens at midnight, woke him, and asked him to come to the cemetery. He arrived 40 minutes later in his parish car, still wearing his sleeping clothes under his coat. I explained what I'd been hearing, showed him the historical records on my phone, told him what we'd unknowingly built Section K on top of. He listened without interruption. Then he walked the section, making the sign of the cross at various plots, murmuring prayers I couldn't quite hear. When he returned to where I stood, his face was pale. I felt something was wrong here, he said quietly. Every burial I've conducted in Section K, I've felt resistance, like the ground doesn't want to receive them, like something beneath is refusing to let them rest. We discussed options, relocating all the burials in Section K, closing the section permanently, conducting a consecration ceremony to sanctify the ground. But none of those addressed the immediate problem. John Doe, waiting in his casket, the voice repeating his desperate plea, the burial scheduled for 9 a.m. Father Stevens made a decision. We'll bury him in Section C, not Section K. He's earned the right to choose. We transported the casket that night. 2 men moving a county burial from the indigent section to the main cemetery, breaking protocols but honoring a request we couldn't ignore. We placed him in Section C, Plot 214, far from Section K and the asylum grounds beneath it. The voice stopped. The funeral home was silent when I returned at 2 a.m. No recordings, no repetitions, just quiet. The burial occurred Friday morning in Section C as Father Stevens had directed. We didn't tell the county about the relocation. We didn't explain the change. We just buried John Doe where he wouldn't be going back to Northwoods, where he could rest without returning to that place. I've since reviewed every burial we've conducted in Section K over the past 15 years. 47 indigent cases, all placed directly over the forgotten asylum cemetery. I've documented the pattern I should have noticed earlier, the unusually high number of equipment failures during Section K burials, the reports from groundskeepers about hearing voices near those plots, the complaints from visitors about feeling unwelcome in that area. We've closed Section K for new burials, redirected all indigent cases to Section C. The county approved it without questions. They don't want to know why. They don't want to acknowledge what's beneath that ground. But I know. And sometimes, late at night when I'm finishing paperwork in my office, I hear it again. faint, distant, but unmistakable. Not the recording, not John Doe's voice. Different voices, dozens of them, all saying the same thing. I'm not going back there. The patients beneath Section K still refusing, still resisting, still waiting for someone to hear them, still saying no. I listen, document, and make sure no one else gets buried there, because they've earned the right to refuse. After everything they endured at Northwoods, they've earned the right to say no, and I'm finally listening.